In this next video, let's dig a little bit into what we mean by equity and how that might really differ substantially from equality. So in many cases, equity and equality are not equivalent to one another. So it can be easy for us to think that the way to do this is just to treat everybody in exactly the same way with equality, that everyone has the same needs, and if we give everyone the same, set of options, that they will come out on the other end with equitable opportunities. And unfortunately, it's just really not that simple. It's important to understand that there are really diverse obstacles to opportunity and structural inequalities that are related to characteristics like poverty, race, disability, age, gender, and class might require really different approaches to providing equal opportunity as an endpoint. So you can't just throw the same solution at everyone. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. So rather than just thinking about providing everyone with the same thing and expecting that they'll have an equal outcome, we need to tailor, in many cases, what we're providing to different people that face different obstacles. So to put it a bit more simply, we might say that equality is about providing everyone with the same thing, regardless of what they need, while equity is about providing people with what they need in order to have comparable opportunities. And thus, it's a bit more about being fair rather than just the same. An interesting but often difficult aspect of this is that equity necessitates some moral judgment because it requires that we assess what is need, whereas equality might be a lot easier because you can effectively just ignore what need is and make sure that everyone has the same thing. That said, I would argue, and a lot of contemporary planners would argue, that equity is by far the more appropriate standard because it strives to give people what they actually need in their everyday lives, as opposed to just an arbitrary provision that might be good from a particular person's perspective. This diagram is fairly widely used to demonstrate some differences between the concept of equality, where everyone is, provided with exactly the same thing, but clearly that thing is, more useful to some people than others and might actually give certain people something they don't really need in order to, access the end goal, which in this case is watching the baseball game. With equity, we give different people different things depending on what they need in order to get to that end goal. Whereas in this case, there's someone who's, left off the bottom because they're not provided with enough to get them to the main goal. Here, you shift that resource, away from someone who might not need it and toward the person who needs it more. And then we could also think about how you might more systematize this equity. So whereas here we're putting resources toward overcoming something that arguably is kind of an artificial barrier, what if we just redesigned the system so that we didn't need to be providing resources that were different between people, but everyone, essentially had the same access, even without additional resources. This is a little bit like what's going on with a curb ramp, where we're helping the people who need to be able to get on and off a curb without stepping, but it doesn't really get in the way or remove exclusive resources from the people who don't need it. They're able to use the facility and, engage with their opportunities just as well as someone who has a slightly different set of needs. The previous diagram has actually been criticized by some people because it presumes that, everyone's essentially starting at the same place. But another really important facet of planning for equity is recognizing that the ground isn't exactly level, that some people are starting with systematic privileges that mean that they might not need as much additional resource to overcome a barrier. So in this case, the ground is not only higher here, but the fence is lower for this person. They definitely don't need the box as much as someone down here who has additional systematic barriers to being able to access the end goal of seeing the game. Equity is about distributing resources, that overcome those systematic barriers. And then the maker of this diagram takes that a step further and suggests that justice is about dismantling some of those systematic barriers that privilege some people over others. So we might imagine there being a couple of levels of approach to addressing inequities and injustices. One is to provide resources that overcome those systematic inequities and privileges. And then another would be to really dismantle those systematic inequities and privileges, which in theory, in the long run, would not only be more just on sort of an ethical basis for the different people involved, but might also save a lot of resources if we're not constantly trying to rebalance in order to address systemic privilege structures. One type of tool that policymakers have for trying to address inequities are what are called redistributive policies. And these are policies that are essentially aimed at leveling the playing field between people who have more resources and people who have less. So a progressive policy is a type of redistributive policy that costs proportionally more for the rich. A good example of this is the federal income tax, where there are different tax brackets, and tax brackets for higher incomes take a larger proportion of income. So you might pay 25% of your income in taxes if you're in a relatively high tax bracket, whereas you might only pay 15% of your income if you're in a relatively low tax bracket. And so what this means is that the policy costs proportionally more for the rich. They're paying a higher proportion of their resources. Alternatively, you could have what might be considered a proportional policy, and this would be a policy where the amount you pay is set in proportion, directly in proportion with your resources. So, for example, we could have a tax structure where just everyone paid 20%, no matter how much you made. So rich people would still be paying more overall in taxes, but they would be paying the same proportion of their resources as poorer people would be. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we might have a regressive policy. And what this means is that it costs proportionally more for poor people. Regressive policies are actually more abundant than you would think. Essentially, any policy or price structure that costs the same for everybody is regressive. So a gas tax, for example, costs the same amount no matter who is pumping the gas. That is a regressive tax. Parking often costs the same no matter who is using it. It's regressive. Transit fares in many places don't give any sort of discounts to low-income people. They are a regressive price structure because rich people pay a much smaller proportion of their resources in order to use transit than do poorer people. So what this means is that in many cases, regressive price structures are essentially the status quo, and the jobs of planners and policymakers that are aiming to improve equity may be looking for ways to make policies that are more proportional or even progressive. That said, redistributive policy does not really address systematic issues in a long-term way. It's more like a Band-Aid. And so, it could be essentially redistributing resources like this with the boxes. It's very unlikely to really address the structural differences that are really causing the need for the redistribution of resources in the first place. Another useful concept when we're analyzing equity and looking for ways to address inequities has to do with how inequity is structured within or between different groups of people. So we might use the term horizontal equity to describe equitable opportunities within a group. For example, transit users could constitute a group, and we could ask whether there are equitable opportunities across transit users. Perhaps transit users within different parts of a city have more or less opportunity than others. Perhaps different transit users are paying more than others depending on which part of the transit system they're using. Maybe there are inequities in the quality of experience between different transit users. And we might imagine developing a policy, within a transit system, so still targeting, this particular group of transit users that tries to reduce inequities, within that particular group. We might also think about vertical equity, which describes equitable opportunities between groups. So again, thinking about a transportation example, we could imagine users of different modes. So for example, do drivers of personal vehicles have similar opportunities to transit users? Do they have similar opportunities to bicycle riders or pedestrians? And how might we reduce inequities, between those different groups, between the users of different modes? And you can see how this might present different challenges because different groups might have really different contexts. But it might be really important just in terms of fairness and equal access to the end goals, the end opportunities that people are trying to reach, to try to reduce disparities between users of different modes.